Most of us are familiar with the physical devastation that was left behind in the wake of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. But what we don't often talk about is what emerged from the crisis unscathed, namely the belief that private property is essential for a healthy, functioning democracy. A 2015 Heartland Monitor poll showed that 70% of Americans under 35 still want to own a home and believe that property ownership can generate personal happiness and political inclusion. These attitudes about ownership reflect what early philosophers of liberalism called the social contract, an arrangement between an individual and the state where an individual agrees to abide by the government's laws in exchange for protection of her property rights. The social contract was, and to some extent still is, considered the optimal way to organize civil society. Yet we've seen that in moments of crisis, the state can't always live up to its end of the bargain. Given these clear material challenges then, why has the fantasy of the ownership society remained so resilient? To answer this question, my dissertation research takes a long view of the history of ownership as a political ideal in American arts and letters. I construct an archive of 19th century literature, philosophy, and political writing, and examine how these texts engage with the precepts of the social contract. In particular, I wanted to see if the consensus was to connect ownership with civic vitality in other moments of economic crisis. My findings were very surprising. In moments of economic uncertainty, 19th century writers were apt to tell new and very different stories about their social and personal welfare. For example, writer Henry David Thoreau uses the language of imprisonment to talk about property ownership, and novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne depicts radical utopian images of community within existing capitalist orders. These are just a few examples of what I've called an alternative aesthetics of ownership, and I coined this term to draw attention to the linguistic and stylistic practices that authors use to build their narrative worlds. So when we think about the relationship between ownership and democracy, we might reasonably think it's an issue for economics or political science. But I want to make a strong case for the significant contribution offered by the humanities on this topic. Completing my research in literary studies has given me the tools necessary to understand the intricate work of narrative formation. What kinds of stories do we tell about our collective identities, and what makes one narrative more persuasive than another? I strongly believe that the ability to tell new stories about our political aspirations is essential for a healthy democracy, especially when our existing narratives about ownership fail our most vulnerable populations. So my job then as a literary scholar is to identify these narratives that haven't really gained cultural currency and bring them out to a wider audience. And to do this, I hope to offer my research in both academic and mass market publishing, a trend that I see as bridging a gap between academic scholarship and the work of public intellectuals. So by rewriting the history of ownership in the 19th century, my dissertation offers a wealth of imaginative resources for rethinking the social contract in the present. Thank you.